How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew. This is Lemora Cards, and today we're taking a look at a cEDH tier list, or making one rather. We just did our quarterly reports. Those aren't our opinions. It's just the top 10 based on top 16s. It's all that. Very straightforward. We don't make the list. People still complain. I don't know what to tell you. But I'll usually mention what we would do for a tier list, and sometimes I make one and post it. And I figured this time I would take a look at more decks. We're gonna be looking at like 24 pretty popular or high performing decks and putting them into a tier list based on performance, how I sort of view them right now. Some I'll skew a little bit away from the numbers. It's not just gonna be, here's the top 24 decks, but it will be skewing towards their potential or how I see them working out in the current meta. And then also making some considerations for some numbers, because there were definitely some that I thought I had a pretty good idea of where they'd be, and then taking a look at it, they actually kind of stand out and maybe should move up or down. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe. We are super close to 10,000 subscribers, which is crazy. Continue with your amazing support. It helps me get to make new things and hopefully do bigger and better things. That includes supporting me over on Patreon, like these amazing patrons did. Patreon.com/LemorasCards. That's in the description below. Get access to cool perks like coaching, private deck advice. Usually put early uploads over there. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and hop into it. This video is brought to you by Beholder Gaming, who is throwing a cEDH 10K July 27th and 28th at Charlie's Collectible Show in Stone Mountain, Georgia. This event is fully proxy friendly, will be one of your last chances to earn points for the Top Deck Invitational, as well as the first Platinum event in the Beholder Gaming Southeastern Circuit, an invitational circuit for players down here in the Southeast. I'll be attending this event, and I can't wait to see you there. It's going to be great. Find out more in the description below. Now, real quick, we're going to go over the tiers. Now, these decks are all, in my opinion, and based on kind of what we've seen, viable tournament decks. So none of these, when you see this D tier here, it doesn't mean like, lol, don't bring it to a tournament, you suck. It's really relative to, these are 24 tournament viable decks. And so I don't think any of these are like joke decks or memes. We're taking a look at pretty real ones, but there are some that are significantly above the rest of the pack in our S tier. This is going to be the top of the top, the decks that are really defining the metagame as it is right now. A tier is the decks a bit below that. These are the ones you really often see top 16 pretty frequently. They're just maybe like a little bit off of that top tier status, or they're not as impactful on defining what is meta relevant. Whereas I think the S tier decks really do decide, hey, these are the things you have to be able to be. If you can't do this, you can't hang. A tier decks are decks that do well into that metagame, but aren't necessarily defining it quite as much. B tier decks are kind of the middle of the road. They kind of perform average for a viable deck. So they do better than most decks still. They're still better than most decks in the format, just compared to like the best of the best, which is where we're looking at here. They're kind of the average of the best. C tier decks are a little bit below that. And D tier, even worse than that. These are the decks that are either in the process of falling off, or maybe they've only just now kind of come into real competitive viability. But yeah, your C's, perfectly fine decks, depending on maybe a metagame shift, could move up to B or even A. Your D's are decks that maybe they move up to C and they kind of come up as they get more stuff. But typically those are like on the edge of what I would recommend to a player. So can't do a full crazy long breakdown on each of these decks. You can see a breakdown of a lot of decks in my recent cEDH beginner guide video. So check that out if you're interested in a more detailed breakdown. But we're going to kind of try to move through this quickly. Easy one right off the bat. Tymna Kraum in S tier. This has been the top of our quarterly reports every single time. It is the most consistently performing deck. Sometimes the conversion rate drops a little bit, but it's always incredibly popular. Gets the most top 16s, usually gets the most wins, gets the best colors. It's the best suited to doing the mid-range draw cards, maybe make the second attempt at winning the game and do it behind some kind of silence protection or Grand Abolisher or whatever. Play as the good guy, but end up, really consistently being the one who just like, okay, I helped everybody out at Slam Grand Abolisher. Anybody got anything? No? Okay, I win. Definitely the definitive mid-range deck of the format. I think a really solid A tier right now is Magda. Magda is incredibly consistent. I talk this deck up a lot. It's quickly become one of the best don't cast spells decks of the format, which really are Wingens term I coined, but it has like an innocuous sort of build up where it's just casting dinky little dwarves, but it will just take over the game eventually. It gets to play incredibly well into stacks. It's one of the few decks that really gets to play stacks and actually perform well. You look at the rest of these decks, you got a kind of loose definition of what a stacks piece is. You might see a deafening silence here and there and a blind obedience. That's about it. Magda's running a whole lot of effects that shut down their opponents. Gets to be a great utility toolbox option. Pretty sick stuff going for it. Has got a lot of good upgrades and is one of the most upgraded decks each set. It pretty much always gets something new to think about. There's always a new artifact coming out and they love treasures. And we've even seen like more and more dwarves, it feels like, get printed. A real D tier option, I think, much as it pains me to say it right now, I think is Etali. I think numbers wise, looking at like the last 3 months ish, Etali is just not really performing well. People know how to play around it. It gets incredibly punished by the clone meta. I frequently talk about how my win rate goes up when someone else casts on Etali. It's just so easy to break that effect when you get it for like 2 mana and they got it for 7. And often it's not really the first Etali flip that does that much. I wouldn't expect to get 7 mana worth of stuff off of Etali typically, but 2 mana, it's pretty easy. You got a lot of consistency issues out of a Gruul deck. Its main thing is just to get 7 mana. Like it in some ways plays similarly to Godo, but it's a fairly different plan. Food chain is frankly bad. I kind of talk about this a lot. I'm not a fan of food chain. It's really hard to recommend Etali outside of you thinking it's fun. And if that's the case, then it's very easy to recommend. But in terms of actually performing in tournaments, there's some good players on it. But the average expectation, I think, for people right now is going to be that you really are not going to be doing that great. And you're going to be better suited on some other deck. A perfect example of a C tier deck, I think, is Talion. Not doing amazingly. We have had some players kind of move off of it who are doing well. There's a couple issues with it where one, there's not really a reason to be in Dimir. The reason is Talion. Talion is a very good card, but you're giving up a lot not being in Esper or, especially Tymna Kraum colors, which you'll see that'll be a theme of this video, is that a lot of the decks in, the B to D range and a little bit in A have the issue of why not play something above in similar colors with a similar game plan. Talion is just such a hard control kind of play style, which I don't think is favored right now. The game's pretty quick, can struggle in very fast pods if it doesn't get a really nice start. Pretty commander reliant, kind of struggles to actually win the game. And again, there's not really a great reward for being in pure Dimir versus Grixis, Esper, 4 or 5 colors. It's an okay deck, and in the right hands, it can play well, but I don't expect someone to just pick it up and pop off. I think I'm going to lump these decks together because they're really lumpable, and that's Atraxa and Tivit. I think they're both kind of solidly B tier. Honestly, their performance now is skewing down towards C, when we'll see how it goes, but I think right now I'm pretty safely putting them in B. They have stuff going for them. It's just not the best stuff. They both have the issue of why not Tymna Kraum, and there's not really a good answer, to be honest. Tivit gets one combo with its commander, and it's running a card that's terrible in a combo that is frankly awkward in some tournament situations. Atraxa does food chain stuff, which we already spoke about, how I don't think it's that great. It gets you to run pretty bad cards. They both have the issues of not really having access to a commander early on unless they just super high roll. Super high rolling is a part of the format, but you kind of want your commander to not be that role. You kind of want them to be that consistent part of your game plan. You'll see a lot of the top tier decks. That's what we see. So both of them kind of on the control-y side of mid-range. Don't have access to red, which features some of the best cards in the format. Especially as we go on, you'll see Breaking Dockside or Underworld Breach. Pretty critical right now. These decks both just lack a bit of speed and lack a bit of consistency, and right now just aren't really favored. Again, a couple meta changes, something that really slows the game down. Maybe, Tivit pops back up, Atraxa could come back up, but I kind of expect these decks to go down before they go up. Another deck that I've kind of been a proponent of, but is not doing very well at all, is Yuriko. I think Yuriko, honestly, based on how it's doing right now, is a D tier deck. I mean, it's pretty popular, but it's rocking like, a 7% conversion rate or something since April. The game plan is kind of awkwardly lined up right now, where the meta game, like I said, is pretty quick. Yuriko plays a lot of dinky little creatures that enable its kind of slower, grindy game plan. It does have a nice bit of inevitability towards the end, but kind of like we talked about in the last quarterly update with like Najeela, the inevitability of like, oh, I'm just going to do damage over time is way less real than like the inevitability of a deck like Magda or Sisay, I feel like, to win. And those decks also have that like crazy boost button of just like, oh, I had a Dockside early on, cast this, just win the game immediately. Whereas Yuriko doesn't really have that. Card quality's iffy. The boards are often pretty gummed up right now, and it can be tough to get in with non-evasive attackers, which Yuriko does have a lot of evasive ones, but yeah. And then also, what is Dimir really offering you? Again, it's just this commander. Kind of might just want to go into something with a few more colors, unless you just really love the ninjas. Welcome to TopDeck.gg, your community's home for everything competitive Magic has to offer. Whether you're hosting an event, playing for a huge prize, or trying to advertise your store to thousands of players, we've got you covered. Using intuitive pairing software, playing Magic is a breeze. All your players have to do is sign up online, then scan the QR code in-store. Give your competitors the gift of perfect information as their bracket updates in real time. Then, when the match is decided, our self-reporting software saves you time and leaves paper match slips in the past. leave the heavy lifting to us so your community can sit back, relax, and have a great day of playing Magic. A deck that I kind of want to put into B, but I think really results-wise as C is Nixilis. I'm a big fan of this deck. It isn't really doing very well. I think its potential in the Stormy shells that don't run too many really terrible Ob cards is actually B tier, maybe even a little bit higher, high end of that or low end of A. But as it is now, Ob just isn't really doing the thing. Could be that it's getting a little bit less attention because there are faster decks that are currently doing very well, kind of eating up from the other turbo options that a lot of people are playing Rogsai or something like that. But having a Rakdos engine that fuels itself is pretty sick. You also see this with like Rakdos the Muscle, but just being able to I cast a spell, I get a card off of it. I do a thing, I get a card off of it. Is really hard to deal with once it's set up. And so when you're doing the Stormy thing, it can be really hard to profitably interact with it, but the deck's just not really quite there right now. It's a bit slower than some of the other fast options. Necessarily eats a little bit of hate in the early game against competent players. Ob is like one of the best engines in the format. It's kind of similar to Talion, except it's just proactive, where you really kind of should force a will this thing or MBT it if you can. And yeah, deck I really like. Deck I think has potential. When I play against good Ob pilots, I feel the strength of it. It's just not there right now. And maybe a reason it's not quite there, that faster deck that's eating up a lot of the attention, is probably Rogsai, which arguably is the defining deck of the format at the moment. Numbers wise, there's an argument between it and a couple decks, obviously like Tymna Kraum, but I think Rogsai is really determining the pace of the format at the moment. The deck was already getting a lot better, not through updates or upgrades, but really just players who are committed to it and believed in it and continually grinded with the deck and have improved just how people play with it and advanced understanding of the deck. And then it also got 2 major upgrades with Flare of Duplication and Necro Dominance. There's some people testing Apple of Eden already, and some people say it's Coat, but it's already got a decent amount of top 16s with Rogsai and some other decks, but we'll see. But this is just the deck right now that is determining what is viable in terms of quick decks. If you're slower than Rogsai and you're not as grindy as Tymna Kraum, you're not as inevitable as some of these other decks that we're going to talk about, you're down here. These decks are definitive for what's going on right now. And Rogsai is the definitive turbo deck. It's incredibly consistent. There are decks that are faster than it, but they're not even worth putting on this list really, because they're not consistent enough. They don't do well. The Rogsai, I think, has completely avoided those Glass Cannon, Paper Tiger accusations with the number of top 16s, top 4s, and wins it's been getting recently, which was its issue for a while, was converting up to the top 4s and wins. And that's not really been a problem for their deck. It's doing incredibly well. Super powerful deck. Still kind of hard to play, but one of the definitive decks at the moment. A deck just under that in status, I would say, is Kenrith, who's another super solid A tier option that I do think could move into S. I expect Kenrith to move up rather than move down, if it moves at all. A 5-color deck that has unique appeal to it. There's a reason to play Kenrith over Tymna Kraum. It might not be better, and I'm not saying it is, but the addition of new creature combo focused options to Kenrith, on top of being able to just be a Thoracle Breach 5-color deck, is really, really nice. The Soul Cauldron / Agatha, whatever, centric builds, getting new cards like Warren Soul Trader, things like that. Kenrith has a lot of flexibility. It's just a really strong deck at the moment. It continually evolves and develops, and it's really been interesting to see it move up. And it's a deck, again, I kind of expect to either be strongly here in the A tier, or maybe if there's some other changes and developments, possibly move up. All right, let's knock some chumps out of the way. A deck that I thought I would be putting right into C cleanly. Honestly, Dargo Thras has some of the worst stats of any of the popular decks right now. It's a 7% conversion rate or something. It is looking dire, but I am going to push against the numbers a little bit and say that I think it's still C tier power level. It's still good enough, but maybe it's not getting that attention. Some good pilots have moved off of it, things like that. And I can't imagine it really is a D tier deck, even though right now it's not looking great for it. Still has a lot of good strengths. It's still one of the faster teamer options. It gets lumped in with Rog Thras, who I think is a good B tier option. I do think Rog Thras is decently better than this deck, but I can't imagine it's 2 tiers worth better. I think maybe some people have moved on to that or moved on to other fast decks or whatever. They're freedom waffling and moving over to Tymna Kraum, but Dargo Thras I think is fine. Decent option. I think Rog Thras just does more. I think Rograk is one of the most busted cards in our format. Getting access to Flare of Duplication as well as Flare of Denial in Rog Thras is super nice. Big thing that I always say is that Dargo makes bad cards playable. Roger makes good cards broken. It just makes your deck more faster and consistent than Dargo ever will. He kind of is more for when you're comboing off, whereas Roger just is like setting you up for smooth sailing the whole way. Maybe another controversial one would be, I think, Kinnan's in C tier right now. This deck is incredibly popular. It's like the second most popular deck in the format, and it's rocking like an 11%, and it's just staying there. That's just like for the whole year so far. It is just really not in the place it was pre Lord of the Rings. And maybe even a little bit after that, where they got the ring and Bowmasters was like, I don't know, maybe not as omnipresent, but this deck is just not doing it right now. You're limited in colors. One thing I talked about in the last quarterly update was how Kinnan has just not got new cards, really. It just somehow is still running like a super similar 99 that it was like over a year ago compared to like every single other deck on this list, which has changed quite a bit, or what didn't even exist back then. It is also in the awkward spot where it's super scary and it's super fast. Doesn't have these turbo wins that it usually presents, but it is so threatening that you kind of have to deal with it, but it needs to play like the good guy control deck. But people don't really want to treat it like that unless, you know, they're in a pod full of much faster decks. It can really get hated out for that. It's often free to hate it out with a Bowmasters. So like it's in a really tricky spot. It's obviously powerful and strong and still popular, but like I wouldn't be surprised if with these numbers and with some of the new options that we've got, we see Kinnan's popularity really start to fall throughout this year, unless it gets some new upgrades, which is like it's incredibly due. Stella Lee was really controversial in our last quarterly update. I don't know why. Again, we don't make the list, but like also the deck is just, we'll see if it continues, but the deck right now is just doing way too well for me to think it's below like B tier. It's really popular. It has like a 25-ish% conversion rate. Maybe it falls off. Maybe it's too much of a glass cannon, but like doing so much better than the decks below it, it's really hard to say like, nope, Stella Lee is just because people on the internet say it's bad, it's bad. Like I can't ignore the results that it's getting more top 16s than most decks in this format and at a good rate. Like presents super fast wins. It can get them out of nowhere, add instant speed. It's just a powerful deck. It could go anywhere sort of in this tier. Maybe it comes down. Again, I'm not committed to Stella Lee. I don't especially care about how it does, but apparently a lot of people do. Probably our last A tier option is Najeela. We talked about how this deck has lost a little bit of its shine, but even though it's still doing well, it's just lost a bit of its identity in terms of the definitive 5-color deck of the format because of options like Sisay, especially Clam Chowder Sisay, which you could argue do a lot of the stuff that Najeela does, but better because Sisay offers so much consistency versus Najeela's kind of backup plan of winning with infinite combats. Najeela having such different options can really put it in an awkward spot where it's getting half of the stuff it wants to do. Maybe it wants to do the Najeela plan, but the board is gummed up and it gets those cards. Maybe it wants to do the Nas thing and the game's really slowed down and there's too many draw engines in play, but it's still doing way too well not to put it in A tier. It still does offer you a 5-color commander that has multiple 1-card win cons. That's a great Jeweled Lotus option. It's good at going fast. It's good at playing mid-rangey. We've even seen a little bit of stacks. So I think it has too many options to go lower than this, but we'll see if people start to abandon it for other options like, well, we'll just go ahead and talk about Sisay, one of the other definitive decks of the format right now. 2 builds that are not equally represented, but are arguably equally viable. One being the traditional Planeswalker Sisay build, which is the definitive don't cast spells, win gen, whatever you want to call it deck that will just win a game if it gets to go long enough, or if it just resolves a Dockside Extortionist. It will tutor up that Planeswalker combo and kill you. Offers a lot of utility. It's a great toolbox deck. It gets to play a little bit of a political game. It plays to the board, but also plays to things that can potentially be on the board. So a lot of times it can be very tricky and try to downplay its position, especially to pilots who don't know what it might be able to throw out at any given moment. And then it just has this 5-color good stuff pile that people play where they use Sisay to go grab Teferi or Cutsoul and then just dump infinite mana into Kinnan and then win, or just win with Nas or Breach or Thassa's Oracle, just running higher card quality stuff that the Planeswalkers kind of gumming up the deck. This is another one of those decks that is just defining how the format works right now. You know, Rocksai's defining the speed. Tymna Kraum is kind of defining the card quality and consistency, and Sisay is just able to do it, just chug along better than any other deck. If the game goes long, Sisay's got it. It also has that emergency button of just boom, slam to Dockside, oh, I win. I will talk about Tymna Thras, which is probably a C tier deck. It's starting to get a bit more popularity. There is some experimenting going on with it. I've talked about how much I really like the Nullbird, like Collector Roof style builds, but it's still continuing to struggle. It's still hard to justify playing it over like Tymna Kraum, which with red offers so much more than green does right now. And some of the newest options for these colors just don't line up that well. Like they don't get to run Chthonian Nightmare like Thras, Vial, Smasher, which is another deck that could be on this list. And I might put it in like the B tier because that deck just keeps getting new stuff. But TNT kind of awkwardly lines up with your, your dorks and your Tymna attacking, which you want to do. Trouble in Pairs is a nice value engine you could run there. But for the most part, I think it's just awkwardly positioned still. These commanders are kind of just so old school right now, right? Thrasios is not really a great engine. It's just an outlet at this point for most decks. Tymna, not the best engine in the world either in this format. We continually see like the Tymna Kraums of the world doing less and less Tymna focused stuff. So you don't really have a great reason to be running these commanders. I'm gonna go against the script here and say that Korvold is a good B tier deck. The numbers aren't the best at the last 3 months. The deck has shown it can pop off and do really well at big events. It's similarly to Nixilis, a storm engine that just benefits off its own game actions, which can be really difficult to deal with once they get it going. If the dockside itself resolves and they're able to just, start cracking treasures and turn mana into cards at the same time, it gets really hard to profitably get a good exchange with them. Any card like a Unearth or Reanimate or whatever just becomes like 1 mana, make 5 mana, draw 5 cards at the low end. It's just a pretty powerful deck. It does have issues like most non-blue decks do with sometimes you just don't really get to have a lot of agency in a game, and that just happens to what you're signing up for. But it's a storm deck that gets better as the game goes too, where the higher that dockside count is, the more mana they have to spend on the Korvold without cracking treasures or sacrificing things like that. And the easier it gets and the harder to deal with them it becomes. And they're also really, really good at being the second person to go for it, because a lot of times the first person to go for it will jam a bunch of mana rocks or whatever, eat up some interaction, and then Korvold can, just have like a Veil of Summer and get through the rest, kind of sneak in there. And it has gotten some nice new options like Chthonian Nightmare. They're looking like people maybe overcorrected post MH3 and ran too many of the new cards, and they're still cleaning the list up and it's developing itself. But we'll see. I think Korvold, stats wise, you could put it at the top of C tier. I think actual power wise, I'm going to go with B tier, probably right around here if it'll let me. Something like this. Another good B tier deck, I think, is Krark Sakashima, which again, order on B tier is kind of tough, but it's got nice new upgrades like Ashling was pretty sick. And in general, this is a deck that gets upgraded pretty frequently. Any cheap instant or sorcery or enabler for casting spells is pretty nice. Always has that issue of sometimes the flips don't work out and you don't do it, but I think is maybe a little underplayed at the moment. It does have that effect of just like, hey, if I J-will and I win the flip, I probably win the game, especially if I win a flip and lose a flip. Game's probably over. That on top of just like its ability to break open a game that goes long enough for them to take over. They're really well positioned into like the Tymna Kraums and to an extent the Sisays as well. They have a lot of interaction to kind of get through the Rog side thing, but they do have to get through it and live through that. And that's the problem with the deck right now, is they are mostly slower than some of these other options, but have their own sort of consistency. Krark Sakashima, a deck I think is pretty good, has a pretty high conversion rate for how little play it's getting. I think is a pretty good option. And unlike a lot of the other decks in its tier, it does have a unique thing going for it that some of the other decks above it don't. And that's kind of what defines a lot of these lower tier decks, is that they don't really have a thing to draw you to them. Krark Sakashima can develop board states that are better than almost any other deck in the format. Marneus, I think, is a good C tier-ish option. I think its potential is B tier and arguably better than some of these dumb commanders like Atraxa and Tivit. Comes down a little bit earlier, has a super broken interaction with Smothering Tide that is incredibly hard to deal with. Gets to be an infinite mana outlet in the command zone. It does have the issue that some of these other decks do of why not Tymna Kraum? Why not add red to your deck and be faster and better? Yeah, it does have that issue. I agree. And the numbers for it really aren't that great. Its conversion rate is pretty low recently, but I do think I still like it in higher end of C, somewhere between these ones. So these last two Grixis options, I think Tevesh Kraum, like some of these other decks, is a deck that is worse than the top tier options right now, but does have a draw to it, because having a fast Grixis shell that has the fallback of commanders that draw cards and an infinite mana outlet in the command zone is a unique draw that these other decks don't have. You do have the issue of why not Blue Farm or why not Rogsai, but the cool thing about this deck is you have two different ways to build. You can build like a grindier Rogsai, or you can build like a faster Tymna Kraum. You can kind of move between them based on the meta that you expect. So it's really a flexible deck in that regard. And honestly, probably has the A tier potential. It's just not quite there at the moment. And I do think it is because some of these other decks are kind of stealing its shine, but I really think there's a draw to it and it's probably underplayed. And same with Malcolm Vial. I also think that's a strong B tier option, probably in a similar spot. You could also throw in some of the other black Malcolm decks like Malcolm Tymna, which is actually performing really well right now. It's just not the most popular deck in the world, but especially the Grixis, I really like. They can build more mid-rangey, running things like Braids, or they can do the really fast Grixis deck that has access to a one card win con with its commander that also kind of generates mana as they go. Pretty powerful deck that is on the up and up at the moment. It was really performing really poorly. I think it's starting to get better and better positioned. Pretty good option right now. And the last one, maybe the most interesting one to talk about, is going to be Nadu. And we're going to drop some stats on you to talk about Nadu. I've mostly been looking at like the last 3 months-ish for stats I've been pulling up so far. But Nadu has only been legal since June 8th. So looking at the time Nadu's been legal, which is really the fairest time to look at, right? Even though it's a short amount of time, but it's over a month. Nadu is tied with Tymna Kraum with 27 top 16s in that time period. The next highest deck is Roxai with 17. So they are head and shoulders above the next highest decks. No one is even close. But Nadu has roughly half the number of entries as Tymna Kraum, getting a 35.5% conversion rate over Tymna Kraum's 19.7. So arguably number one in top 16s, is straight up number one in top 4s with 11 top 4s to Roxai's 8 at number 2, and currently has the most wins of any deck in that time frame with 3 to Roxai's 2. Kenrith also has 2, and then there's a bunch of 1-ups. So I think Nadu is pretty definitively in the S tier. Now, the order of the S tier is really hard to say. I think looking at the time Nadu's been legal, I think this is actually what the S tier looks like from the time Nadu's legal. It's hard to say it is the best deck because it has been such a short period of time, but since it's been legal, it's the best, which is insane because we've never, I don't even think for a period longer than a month, had a deck over Tymna Kraum when looking at the numbers. Certainly not one on release. It's completely unheard of. Completely insane. Tymna Kraum's always been number one in basically everything. But Roxai is also above Tymna Kraum right now in most of those numbers other than top 16s. So this might actually be my list, mostly ordered. Some of these you can move around. Rog Thras is probably below like this and something like this. I'm not really sure how I'd order these, but Nadu kind of being the definitive busted commander to break, right? We've got Roxai's the turbo deck of the format. Tymna Kraum's the consistent mid-range deck. Sisay mostly being the win-gen, don't cast spells deck that just breaks a long game. And Nadu is just this, once it gets going, this unstoppable advantage engine that if they untap with a free targeter, basically wins the game or always has the option to, regardless of how many other resources they have access to. They can just spin their wheels and just get their entire deck into their hand or onto the battlefield. This is the deck to watch out for right now. Where it ends up, hard to say. Could drop to A, could end up being people target it, but I kept hearing over and over that like, oh no, Nadu's not a problem. You just do this, you just do that. But people talk about it like it's Winota, but Winota was never this dominant, I don't think. And people have came incredibly ready for this deck at events, and it still will get in a couple top 16s into that event, even if it's super respected. Kind of seems like Nadu might be the real deal, and maybe I was wrong about it. And it actually is that broken tier. Certainly better than playable. It is definitely a staple of the format right now. I don't know. Let me know what you think. So let me know what you think of this tier list. It's mostly ordered, but it's pretty hard on some of these decks, especially ones that I kind of skewed towards their potential versus their stats. This top tier, I think, is really, really close. Although I do think right now, kind of looking at the numbers, it's only one of these 3 is the top. And I think Sisay is not a tier below, but just not number 1. And the rest of these decks do have a chance at being number 1 right now. And I do think we'll see that it's just going to be really tournament dependent, which one of these decks looks like the best deck of the format. I mean, we just this past weekend had a tournament where Sisay was absolutely dominant. The same day, Roxai had 5 top 16s in one tournament. And then Nadu, I mean, day 1 had the triple Nadu top 4. Like, I don't know. This is a new era where the 4 new pretty major contenders. And right now it looks like Nadu might be number 1. So let me know if you're interested in doing one of these. Maybe make your own. Reply to me on Twitter about it. Let me know down below some of your decks that you would add on here, where you'd put them, any changes you'd make. Just don't say tier list bad. That doesn't help anybody. Just let me know what you think. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.